Silly Nick. Hello, sweetheart.
Hello, how are you? All right?
Tired, how are you?
Oh, good, thank you. Yeah, I don't good. Right.
Hello. Nick and Katie have turned invisible.
They have. It's into cushions. Yeah.
It's our party trick. No, I'm behind the camera taking all my clothes off.
Ah, okay.
So I can put my jammies on.
Ah, good thinking. So how has day 2 of the holiday been?
Yeah.
We found all of the slows in the world.
Yeah.
I'm
They're all
jealous. I
here.
couldn't find any clothes the last 2 years.
Yeah. They're all here.
All of them.
All of them. Literally,
wow.
they're all here.
So did you pick
We
a whole
went for a
basket full?
walk, and every single hedgerow that we passed was just dripping with them.
Wow, okay.
It's insane.
Hmm.
So
have you got buckets full?
No.
we've got 2 paper bags full
Hmm.
because we don't really have anything to contain them in.
We were on a walk. We went on a slow cooking expedition.
Yeah.
We might go on
okay.
a slow cooking expedition tomorrow.
Hey, Frankie.
Hi,
Hey, Frankie.
sweeties.
Hey, Jen.
Hey,
Good
Jen.
evening, Frankie.
How you doing, everybody?
Good. Nick and Katie just telling us about their slow experience today.
Oh.
Berries everywhere.
Yeah.
Oh.
We found all of the slows, like all of them.
Tell me more.
We went on. So the little cottage that we're in is like it tucked away in this tiny little back lane by itself, like. And we went for a little amble up the lane and came across some slows, and we were like, "Slows, amazing!" So we picked a load of slows, and then we went on a bigger walk, like to the abbey and then further around, and every single hedgerow that we passed was just dripping with them, like they're everywhere.
That is so. So is it? Do you think is it okay to pick slows yet? Is it officially slow season yet?
Oh yeah, totally.
I don't know if I've ever tried
Slow
one.
gin. They're still better if you stick them in the freezer overnight before putting the gin in.
Yes, that's what. So I heard that it's best to pick them after they've had the first frost on them.
That's
But
the traditional one, but the birds eat them all if you wait for that.
Is
So-
that?
You can cheat by throwing them in the freezer overnight.
Is slow gin what they have in store from you, Katie and Nick?
Slow gin and slow whiskey.
Slow whiskey.
Lisa introduced us to it.
Ah.
In fact, we have a bottle with
God, that
us that
sounds
we
good.
brought
We've got
with us.
there's a shit ton of slows now round near. How exciting! Who else?
So have you met up with Lisa yet? Was that
Hey,
a
Jane.
thing
Yeah.
today? Oh, fantastic. How was it?
We went and saw Lisa and Jonas yesterday,
Oh, how wonderful.
which was lovely.
So girly.
And then we had to leave.
And then we had to leave.
That's the wrong answer.
Hey, Carmen.
Hey, Carmen.
You okay?
Oh, is somebody echoing? Is there some sort of feedbacks happening? Maybe tiny bit. We'll keep an eye on it. So are you having a lovely holiday? It sounds like it.
So far.
Apart from the people who Nick's doing a job interview with are being dicks and saying that he needs to do an interview this week.
What?
Yeah, it's getting very annoying.
Sounds very annoying. Do you want me to have a word?
Okay, love you to have a word.
I'll do that. Oh no!
Oh, revealing secrets there, Frankie.
My Storytime rig is not having a happy time. It doesn't want to stand upright.
Oh dear.
Are you going to be okay, guys?
Hey, Malcolm.
Hi.
Malcolm,
Oh.
haven't seen you in a while.
Hi,
Yeah.
Malcolm.
Busy bee last week, but I did quite a bit of catching up today.
Ah, nice.
Same, I binged it today. So
Yeah.
I'm very
Yeah, it was good. And I was just like scraping a radiator at the same time. Very exciting.
Rock and roll.
Thank
dear.
you. Hi, Jonathan. What else have we got? Hi, Martin. Hi, Kitchen Martin.
Mhm.
Hi, Ella. Hi, Pontiff. Hi, Em. What a good gang. Oh!
Hey.
Oh, it's weird being back.
Yeah, when did you get back?
Literally just got back this morning.
Yeah.
Or like got back today, so drove back this morning and then had a meeting in work at like lunchtime, and that went on for a few hours. So I've not been, got back to the house kind of relatively late in the afternoon, and just been sort of chilling and putting all of my stuff away and doing laundry and so on and so forth. But nice to be back with my books at least.
Oh, that's sweet.
Got so many more to try and insert into the shelves somewhere.
Could you not put an extra shelf on each shelf?
I can't. They're not the kind that you can just kind of get extra shelves with. They're
No,
like,
but we could fashion them, using the creative, crafty genius of some of us, I'm sure.
You could probably put extra shelves on the bottom of them more easily than you could on the top.
on the bottom.
Yeah.
Well, I was meaning between the layers, as in you've got like a single layer, but if you just had double the shelves there, within the same height.
But then would all of my books that are like some of them would, but I suppose I could just like stack them like that rather than like that.
Maybe.
Or I could just cram them in more tightly.
Press them down really hard.
Or buy more shelves.
Oh, I got a new book today. Can I show you?
Yes.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah. Hi, Ella. Good to meet you.
We have a new person. Hi, Ella.
Hiya.
Hi, Asher as well. Woo! Ella, are you caught up on previous sessions, or are you joining for the first time tonight?
I'm joining for the first time. Yeah.
So, would you like to have a little intro guide to what on earth is happening, or have you read the book before?
I would love a little intro guide always.
Fantastic. Well, what time is it? How are we doing for time?
It's story time.
Is it story time? Okay.
Recap on story counts as story, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, let's do the Hold on, let me find a cushion to sit on. No, that's better. So, quick recap, and then we'll dive in for realsies. I'll just kind of like skate roughly over it. If I leave anything out, or if there's anything that anyone thinks is like relevant for people to know, please do either shout up or drop things in the chat. So our two main characters are a golem and a Djinni. The golem was created by a sort of fairly evil old mystic called Yehuda Shalman, who is a very kind of clever man, was originally trained to be a rabbi, but then had a dream that made him convinced that he was going to go to hell, and so has like devoted his life to learning kind of ancient Kabbalistic arts to try and find a way around that, including learning how to make a golem. So he made the golem, who is a female golem of the title, as a bride for a man going to America. The man died in the crossing, leaving the golem kind of masterless and loose in New York City. She has been taken in by a Rabbi Avram Meir, who has named her Hava, and is kind of educating her and kind of trying to look after her, and sort of, get her to kind of learn how to be as a sort of golem without a master. Meanwhile, we have the Djinni, who is has been trapped in a lamp for 700 years. We don't know, he doesn't know how he got there, or who put him there, other than it being this sort of kind of evil looking old man. And we periodically get kind of flashbacks to his life in the Syrian desert 700 years ago, and his growing fascination with humans, and particularly the Bedouin tribe, and a young girl, Fadwa al-Hadid, who he's kind of has he made contact with her, or she's seen his palace, and he's sort of growing more and more interested in the humans, which would be not usual kind of Djinni behavior. And he's been given the name Ahmad by his friend, his kind of equivalent of the Rabbi Arbili. I know this is probably all quite a lot, but hopefully it will start to click into place once you start listening.
Worth distinguishing, sorry Frankie, that the interactions in the desert seem to have happened like the 700 years ago, and now he's also in New York now, like the 700 years later.
Yes, yeah, he was accidentally released by a tinsmith who was repairing the lamp that he was trapped in, and he is now apprenticed to that tinsmith. So he and the golem are both kind of a little bit sort of adrift in New York, these two sort of kind of magical creatures who have wound up there by accident and are just trying to make their way in the world and make sense of the world that they find themselves in and their own natures and things.
And the genie was in the lamp of a woman named Miriam, and there's a bit about Miriam just being fucking lovely.
Yes, yeah. The lamp belonged to a woman named Mariam Fadul, who everybody is in love with, and she sounds fucking lush. So yes,
the ice cream maker.
And the ice cream maker. Thank you, God.
Yeah.
You're so good at this. There's an ice cream maker called Ice Cream Salah, or Mahmoud Salah, who was originally a doctor back in near Cairo, I think, was it in Cairo that he was? And he went to the house of somebody that he was trying to heal one day, and it turned out that they were possessed by an ifrit or a Djinni or something, and the being then possessed him, and he has been possessed and had like a horrible tragic life, has come to New York also, and I think that's about as I don't want to get
talked about the lovely rabbi and who the golem's with now, like how she gets kind of rescued. Have we done that?
Touched on that very briefly, in that she's kind of got like she was sort of noticed and been taken under the wing of this rabbi mayor. I think we probably need to get started, so if there's anything that occurs to anybody else, please do just drop it in the chat, or Ella or anyone else who's joining us for the first time, if there's anything that you're like, wait, what's going on, shout up in the chat, or if necessary, just like unmute and shout at me. I think that will probably be okay. How is this all sounding to everybody? Does that all sound good? Okay, well, in that case, my loves, I think it might be story time. So, with that bearing in mind, are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. All things considered, it was not one of Michael Levy's better days. He stood behind his paper-strewn desk with the harried air of a man reacting to a dozen crises at once. In his hand was a letter informing him, with regret, that the ladies who volunteered to clean on Sundays would no longer be doing so. Their Ladies' Workers' League had schismed and then dissolved, and with it their Charitable Action Committee. 10 minutes earlier, the head housekeeper had informed him that a number of that week's residents had arrived with dysentery, and they were going through bed linens at an alarming rate. And, as always, there was the almost physical pressure of the nearly 200 new immigrants who bunked in the dormitories that hung above his head. And as long as they were under his roof, Michael was responsible for their welfare. The Hebrew sheltering house was a way station where men fresh from the old world could pause and gather their wits before jumping headfirst into the gaping maw of the new. All were allowed to stay 5 days at the sheltering house, during which they were fed and clothed and given a cot to sleep on. At the end of those 5 days, they had to depart. Some moved in with distant relations or took the peddler's path. Others were recruited by the factories and slept in filthy flophouse hammocks for 5 cents a night. When he could, Michael tried to steer the men away from the worst of the sweatshops. Michael Levy was 27 years old. He had the sort of pink, wide-cheeked face that was cursed to perpetual youth. Only his eyes showed the years. They were deeply lined and shadowed by reading and fatigue. He was taller than his uncle Avram, and something of a scarecrow, the result of never slowing down and eating a proper meal. His friends liked to joke that with his ink-stained cuffs and tired eyes, he looked more like a scholar than a social worker. He would reply that it was only fitting, as his work was more of an education than a classroom could ever offer. There was pride and defensiveness in his answer. His teachers, his aunt and uncle, his friends, even his all but absent father, all had expected him to go to university. And they'd been shocked and dismayed when young Michael announced his plan to dedicate himself to social work and the betterment of the lives around him. Of course, that's all good and noble, a friend told him. Which one of us isn't committed to the same thing? But you've got a first-rate mind. Use that to help people. Why let it go to waste? The friend in question wrote for one of the Socialist Labour Party papers. Every week his name ran above a moving paean to the working man, each turning on a scene of brotherly solidarity that he'd happened to witness, usually conveniently enough on the day before his deadline. Michael stood firm, if somewhat wounded. His friends wrote their articles. They went to marches and listened to speeches. They debated the future of Marxism over coffee and strudel. But Michael heard an airy emptiness in their rhetoric. He didn't accuse his friends of taking an easy road, but neither could he follow them. He was too honest a soul. He had never learned to deceive himself. The only one who understood was his uncle Avram. It was the other change in Michael's life that the rabbi couldn't countenance. Where is it written that a man must turn his back on his faith to do good in the world? The rabbi had asked, staring in horror at his nephew's bare head, at the neat sideburns where sidelocks had once hung. Who taught you this? Those philosophers you read? Yes, and I agree with them. Not with everything, maybe, but at least that as long as we keep to our old beliefs, we'll never find our place in the modern world. His uncle laughed. Yes, this wonderful modern world that has rid us of all ills, of poverty and corruption. What fools we are not to cast our shackles aside. Of course, there's much that still needs changing, but it does no good to chain ourselves to a backward... He stopped. The word had slipped from his mouth. His uncle's expression grew even darker. Michael saw he had two options: recant and apologise, or own what he'd said. I'm sorry, Uncle, but it's how I feel, said Michael. I look at what we call faith, and all I see is superstition and subjugation. All religions, not just Judaism. They create false divisions and enslave us to fantasies when we need to focus on the here and now. His uncle's face was stone. You believe me to be an instrument of subjugation? The instinct to protest was on his lips. Of course not. Not you, Uncle. But he held back. He didn't want to add hypocrisy to his list of offences. Yes, he said. I wish I felt otherwise. I know how much good you've done. How could I forget all those visits to the sick and the time the Rosen store burned down? But good deeds should come from our natural instinct towards brotherhood, not from tribalism. What about the Italians who owned the butcher's shop next to the Rosens? What did we do for them? I can't take care of everybody, snapped the rabbi. So perhaps I'm guilty of only looking after my own kind. That too is a natural instinct, whatever your philosophers might say. But we must grow beyond it. Why reinforce our differences and keep ancient laws and never know the joy of breaking bread with our neighbours? Because we are Jews, his uncle shouted. And that is how we live. Our laws remind us of who we are, and we gain strength from them. You, who are so eager to throw away your past, what will you replace it with? What will you use to keep the evil in man from outbalancing the good? Laws that apply to everyone, said Michael, that put all men on equal footing. I'm no anarchist, uncle, if that's what worries you. But an atheist? Is that what you are now? He could see no way around it. Yes, I think I am, he said, looking away to hide from the pain in his uncle's eyes. For a long, miserable time after, Michael felt he might have well have struck the man across the face. They'd been slow to reconcile. Even now, years later, they only saw each other once a month or so. They kept a cordial small talk and avoided opinions on painful subjects. The rabbi congratulated Michael on each success and spoke consoling words at his defeats, which were many, for Michael's job was far from easy. When the previous supervisor, who'd insisted on only taking money from Jewish socialist groups, had quit, the sheltering house was weeks away from shutting from lack of funds. Michael was invited to accept the position and saw for himself the many dozens of men in their dormitories. The weave of their clothes, the cut of their beards, and the vaguely bewildered air all marked them out as fresh from the boat. These were the most vulnerable of the immigrants, most likely to be duped or swindled. He reviewed the house's ledgers, which were in chaos. He accepted the position, then swallowed his pride and went to the local congregations and Jewish councils, begging for lifeblood. In exchange, advertisements for Sabbath services were posted on the notice board in the hallway, next to the announcements of party meetings. He still believed what he told his uncle. He attended no synagogue, said no prayers, and hoped that one day all men would lose their need for religion. But he knew that sweeping change only happened slowly, and he understood the value of pragmatism. The rabbi saw the religious advertisements when he visited, but said nothing. He too seemed to regret the rift between them. They were practically each other's only relations, Michael's father having long since decamped for Chicago, leaving behind a dozen frustrated creditors. And in a neighbourhood of sprawling families, Michael felt it keenly. So when the rabbi came knocking on his office door that afternoon, Michael was truly glad to see him there. "Uncle, what brings you here?" The men embraced, a bit formally. Michael had grown used to his own uncovered head, the lack of fringe beneath his vest, but he still felt naked in the man's presence. Then he caught sight of the woman in the door's shadow. "I'd like you to meet a new friend," said the rabbi. "Michael, this is Hava. She's newly arrived in New York." "I'm pleased to meet you," the woman said. She was tall, taller than him by an inch or two. For a moment she seemed a dark and looming statue, but then she moved forward into the room and was merely a woman in a plain shirtwaist, holding a cardboard box. Michael realised he was staring. He caught himself. "Likewise, of course. How long have you been here?" "Only a month." She gave a small, embarrassed smile, as if apologising for her recent arrival. "Hava's husband died on the voyage," his uncle said. She has no family in America. I've become her social worker after a fashion. Michael's face fell. My God, how terrible. I'm so sorry. Thank you. It was a whisper. There was a moment of silence, awkward with the weight of her revealed widowhood. Then the woman seemed to notice the box in her hands. I made these, she said, a bit abruptly. They were meant for your uncle, but I made too many. He suggested I bring them to you and you could give them to the men who live here. She held out the box to Michael. He opened it, unleashing a heavenly scent of butter and spices. The box was full of pastries, all different kinds. Butter horns, almond macaroons, spice cookies, sweet buns, ginger snaps. You made all of these, he said, incredulous. Are you a baker? The woman hesitated, but then smiled. Yes, I suppose I am. Well, the men will certainly appreciate these. We'll make sure everyone gets a piece. He closed the box, fighting temptation. The almond macaroons in particular were making his mouth water. They'd been his favourite since childhood. Thank you, Chava. This will be a great treat for them. I'll take them straight to the kitchen. You should try a macaroon, she said. He smiled. I will. They're my favourite, actually. She seemed to catch hold of herself, then said, I'm glad. Chava, the rabbi said, perhaps you might wait for me in the parlour. The woman nodded. It was a pleasure to meet you, she said to Michael. And you as well, he replied. And thank you, truly, on behalf of all the men. She smiled and withdrew into the hallway. For such a tall woman, she moved quite silently. My God, what a tragedy for her, Michael said when she was out of earshot. I'm surprised she stayed in New York instead of going back home. There was little there for her, his uncle said. In a way, she had no choice. Michael frowned. She isn't living with you, is she? No, his uncle said quickly. She's staying with her former congregant for now, an old widow. But I must find her a more permanent living situation and a job as well. Shouldn't be difficult. She seems capable, if quiet. Yes, she's very capable. But at the same time, she's almost painfully innocent. It makes me afraid for her. She'll need to learn how to protect herself to live in this city. At least she'll have you to look out for her. His uncle smiled grimly. Yes, for now. An idea had been forming in Michael's mind. Finally, he gave it his attention. You say you're looking for a job for her? Yes, not a sweatshop if I can help it. Are you still in touch with Mo Radzin? We're cordial enough to say hello on the street, I suppose. He frowned. You think there might be a job for Chava at Radzin's? I was just there yesterday. The place was in chaos and Mo was having fits. One of his assistants ran off to God knows where, and another is leaving to take care of her sister. He smiled and pointed to the box. If these taste as good as they look, then the bakery could use her. You should go talk to them. Yes, the rabbi said slowly. It's a possibility. But Mo Radzin, I know. He's just as sour and unhappy as ever. But he's fair, at least, and generous when he wants to be. The house gets all our bread from him at discount. And his employees seem to respect him. Well, except for Thea. The rabbi snorted. Thea Radzin was a formidable complainer, the sort of woman who began conversations with a list of her ailments. Among her husband's female employees, she worked as a matchmaker in reverse, listing their defects to any man who showed an interest. Michael pressed on, feeling obscurely that if he could help his uncle, some of his guilt would be unburdened. There are worse bosses than Mo Radzin, and perhaps he'll feel some obligation to treat Chava well if he knows you're watching out for her. Perhaps. I'll speak to him. Thank you, Michael. He squeezed his nephew's shoulder. And Michael, with a burst of concern, saw that his uncle had never looked so worn and tired, not even when dealing with the stresses of congregation. He'd always worked himself far too hard. And now, instead of resting, he'd taken the welfare of a young widow upon himself. Michael wanted to suggest that there were any number of women's groups that could look after her, but the Jewish women's charities, he knew, were even more strapped than the men's. He said goodbye to his uncle and sat back at his desk. Even with his misgivings about his uncle's health, the brief glimpse of the woman had intrigued him. She'd seemed quiet and shy, but the way she'd looked at him had been unnerving. She'd stared directly into his eyes, unblinking, a deep and candid gaze. He understood what his uncle meant about her needing to protect herself, but at the same time Michael felt that it was he, not she, who had been laid bare. The sheltering house's parlour was surprisingly spacious, running the length of the dim front hall. The golem stood in the corner next to a dilapidated wing chair. It was now mid-morning, and many of the men in the dormitories had left already to look for work or a place to pray. But close to 60 remained, and the weight of their worrying minds pressed down on the golem from above. It reminded her powerfully of her first night on the Baltica, how the passengers' fears and desires had been amplified by the strange surroundings. These were the same wild hopes, the same apprehensions. It hadn't been as bad in Michael's office. She'd been too focused on the challenge of speaking to a stranger and not giving herself away. Just realised I forgot. Oh yeah, thanks, Sean. Mind reader. She was beginning to fidget. How much longer would the rabbi be? Against her will, she glanced up at the ceiling. Up there was hunger, loneliness, fear of failure, and loud wishes for success, of home, of a gigantic platter of roast beef, and one man who stood in line for the WC, wanting only a newspaper to read while he waited. She glanced at the parlour table. An issue of Fauverts lay there, waiting to be claimed. No, she said to herself, louder than she had meant. She left the parlour and began to pace the long, dim corridor. Her hands gripped her elbows. She would knock on Michael's door, to tell the rabbi that they needed to leave, that she didn't feel well. To her relief, the office door opened, and the rabbi and Michael stepped out, saying a few last words to each other. The rabbi saw the golem's strained expression, and his goodbye grew more hurried. At last they were walking down the dark wooden hall to the rectangle of sunlight at its end. "Are you all right?" asked the rabbi when they were on the street. "The men," she began, and found she couldn't go on. Her thoughts were too quick, too choppy. She struggled to relax. "They all want so much," she got out at last. "Was it too much for you?" "No. Nearly. If we'd stayed." The silent clamour of the sheltering house faded behind her, was swallowed into the diffuse buzz of the city. Her mind began to slow. She shook out her fingers, feeling the tension ebb. "There was a man upstairs," she said. "He wanted a newspaper. I saw one in the parlour and nearly brought it to him." "That would have been quite a surprise for him." He tried to speak lightly. "You were able to hold back, though." "Yes, but it was difficult." "You are improving, I think, though you nearly gave yourself away with the macaroons." "I know." She cringed at the memory, and the rabbi smiled. "Hava," he said, "it's a cruel irony that you have the most difficulty precisely when those around you are on their best behaviour. I suspect you would find it much easier if we all cast politeness aside and took whatever we pleased." She considered. It would be easier at first. But then you might hurt each other to gain your wishes and grow afraid of each other and still go on wanting. Approval raised his eyebrows. "You're becoming quite the student of human nature. Do you think you have improved enough to go out regularly on your own? Say, to hold down a job?" Apprehension clutched at her, mingled with excitement. I don't know. I'm not sure how I would know, except through trying. Michael tell me that Radzin's bakery is looking for new workers. I know Mo Radzin from years ago, and I thought I might try to get you a position there. I should be able to secure an interview with him at least. A bakery? It would be hard work and long hours surrounded by strangers. You'd have to take constant care. She tried to imagine it. Working all day with her hands, in an apron and a starched cap. Stacking the neat rows of loaves, their brown undersides still dusty with flour, and knowing that she had made them. I'd like to try, she said. Chapter 7. On a warm Saturday in September, the Djinni stood at the back of a crowded rental hall and watched as a man and woman were united in the Maronite Catholic sacrament of marriage. Despite the palpable joy of the other onlookers, he was not in the best of moods. Why should I go when I don't even know them? He'd asked Arbeli that morning. You're part of the community now. You'll be expected at these things. I thought you said I should maintain some distance while I'm still learning. Distance is one thing, rudeness is another. Why is it rudeness if I don't know them? And I still don't understand the purpose of a wedding. What could possibly induce two free beings to partner only with each other for the rest of their existence? Here the conversation had deteriorated. Arbeli, flustered and aghast, tried to defend the institution, bringing forth every argument he could think of. Paternity and legitimacy, marriage's civilizing influence, the need for chastity in women and fidelity in men. The Djinni scoffed at each of these, insisting that the Djinn had no such preoccupations, and he saw no need why men and women should either. To which Arbeli said that it was just the way it was, regardless of what the Djinni thought, and he must attend the wedding and try to keep his opinions to himself. And the Djinni replied that of all the creatures he'd ever encountered, be they made of flesh or fire, none was quite as exasperating as a human. At the front of the hall, the bride and groom knelt as the priest swung a censer back and forth above them. The bride, 18 years old, was named Layla but called Lulu, a name that suggested a sauciness not at all evident in the small and shyly smiling girl. Her bridegroom, Sam Hosseini, was a round and friendly man, well known in the community. He had been one of the first Syrian merchants to settle on Washington Street, and his imported goods store was a neighborhood mainstay, attracting clients from far beyond its borders. Over the years, he'd become quite prosperous and was generous in helping his neighbors, so few begrudged him his success. As the priest intoned the service, Sam beamed with happiness and cast occasional glances down at Lulu, as if to confirm his great luck. The ceremony ended, and everyone walked to the Fadul's coffee house for the wedding banquet. The cafe tables were covered with platters of kebabs and rice and spinach and meat pies, and ribbon-tied bags of sugared almonds. Women crowded on one side of the coffee house, chatting and eating. On the other side, men poured arak into each other's glasses and traded news. Sam and Lulu sat at their own small table in the middle, receiving congratulations, looking dazed and happy. A gift table near the door held a growing collection of boxes and envelopes. But the Djinni was not amongst the crowd. He was in the alley behind the coffee house, sitting cross-legged on an abandoned wooden crate. The atmosphere in the wedding hall had been oppressive, humid with sweat and incense and perfume, and he was still irritated by what he saw as a pointless ceremony. He had no wish to be cooped up in the coffee house with dozens of strangers. Besides, the day had turned beautiful. The sky between the buildings was a pure blue, and a meandering breeze cleared the smell of refuse from the alley. From his pocket, he pulled a handful of gold necklaces, purchased from a shabby storefront on the Bowery. Arbeli had taken him there, saying it was the only place he knew of to purchase gold inexpensively. But he had seemed uncomfortable and frowned at the low prices, later remarking that he was certain they'd been stolen. They were of middling workmanship. The links were not entirely uniform, and the chains hung in an uneven sort of way, but the gold was of good quality. The Djinni gathered them into one palm and cupped his hands around them to melt them, and then began idly to shake the metal. When his hands stilled, he was holding a miniature golden pigeon. With a thin, pointed wire, he added a few details, the suggestion of feathers, pinprick eyes, and then surrounded the bird with a filigree cage. It felt good to work with his hands instead of the crude tools that Arbeli insisted he use when someone might be watching. The alleyway door of the coffee house opened. It was Arbeli. "There you are," the man said. A small plate and a fork were in his hands. Irritated, the Djinni said, "Yes, here I am, enjoying a moment of solitude." A flash of hurt passed over the man's face. "I brought you a piece of the kinafe," he said. "It's about to run out. I was worried you wouldn't get any." Guilt pricked vaguely at the Djinni. He knew Arbeli was doing much to help him, but it made him feel oppressed and beholden, and it was hard to keep from lashing out. He slipped the caged bird into his pocket and accepted the proffered plate, which held a square of something heavy-looking, with brown and cream-coloured layers. He frowned. "What exactly is this?" Arbeli grinned. "The closest thing to heaven on earth." The Djinni took a cautious bite. The act of eating was still difficult, not the mechanism itself. Chewing and swallowing were simple enough actions, and the food burned to nothingness inside him. But he'd never tasted anything before, and had been taken completely by surprise at his first experiences of flavour. The sensations of sweet and savoury, salt and spice were arresting, even overwhelming. He'd learned to take the food in small bites and chew slowly. Even so, the kinafe was a shock. Sweetness burst across his tongue, and thin strands of dough crunched between his teeth, the sound echoing deep in his ears. A creamy tartness made his jaw tighten. "Do you like it?" asked Arbeli. "I don't know. It's startling." He took another tentative bite. "I think I like it." Arbeli looked around the alley. "What are you doing out here, anyway?" "I needed a moment of quiet." "Ahmad," Arbeli said, and the Djinni cringed at the name, his but not his. "I understand, really. God knows I'm the same at these things. But we don't want people to think you're a recluse. Please come in and say hello. Smile once or twice. For me, if not yourself." Reluctantly, the Djinni followed Arbeli back to the party. Inside, the tables had been pushed to the edges of the room, and a group of men was dancing in a fast-moving ring, their arms about each other's shoulders. The women crowded around them, cheering and clapping. The Djinni stood out of the way in the back of the room and observed the bride through breaks in the crowd. Of all the people at the wedding, she was the one who'd caught his interest. She was young and pretty, and clearly very nervous. She barely touched the food in front of her, but smiled and spoke with the well-wishers who approached their table. Next to her, Sam Hosseini ate like a starving man and stood to greet everyone with hugs and handshakes. She listened to her new husband talk and looked up at him with obvious fondness, but occasionally she would glance about as if looking for reassurance. The Djinni remembered what Arbeli had told him, that she was only a few weeks in America, that Hosseini had proposed to her on a visit home. And now, the Djinni reflected, she was in a new place, on unsure footing, surrounded by strangers. Like himself, in a way. A shame that, according to Arbeli, she now belonged to this man only. The bride was still scanning the room. The dancing men spun to one side, and she saw the Djinni regarding her. He held her in his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked away, and when she greeted the next guest, there was colour high in her cheeks. Ahmad, would you like coffee? He turned, startled. It was Mariam. She carried a tray of tiny cups, each full of thick, cardamom-scented coffee. She wore her customary hostess's smile, but her eyes carried an edge of warning. Clearly, she'd seen his interest. So you can drink to their happiness, she said. He lifted a cup from her tray. Thank you. Of course, she replied, and moved on. He eyed the diminutive cup of coffee. Liquid in such a small amount would not hurt him, and it smelled interesting enough. He downed it all at once, as he'd seen the others do, and nearly choked. It was incredibly bitter. Drinking it felt like an assault. He winced and set the cup on a table. He'd had enough of human revelry for one day. He searched out Arbeli in the crowd, caught the man's eye, and pointed at the door. Arbeli held up one hand as if to say, wait a moment, and indicated the newlyweds' table. But the Djinni did not want to congratulate the happy couple. He was in no mood to speak words he didn't feel. As Arbeli tried to wave him over, the Djinni moved through the crowd, left the stifling coffeehouse, and went out into the city. The Djinni walked north along Washington Street, wondering if he'd ever be truly alone again. At times, the desert had felt too empty for him, but this opposite extreme was harder to bear. The street was no less crowded than the coffeehouse had been. Families thronged the sidewalks, all taking advantage of the warm weekend afternoon. And where there were not humans, there were horses, a standstill parade of them, each attached to a cart, each cart carrying a man, each man yelling at the others to clear out of his way, all in a myriad of languages that the Djinni had never before heard, but nevertheless comprehended. And now he was coming to resent his own seemingly inexhaustible resources of understanding. He was not walking aimlessly. He had a destination in mind. A few days earlier, Arbeli had shown him a map of Manhattan and offhandedly pointed out a long green hole in the island's middle. Central Park, Arbeli had said. It's immense, nothing but trees and grass and water. You'll have to see it someday. Then the tinsmith had moved on to other topics, such as where to catch the elevated and which neighbourhoods to avoid. But that long, open expanse of green had caught the Djinni's attention. He had only to find an elevated platform on 6th Avenue, and the elevated, it seemed, would take him there. At 14th, he turned east, and the crowd began to change character. There were fewer children, and more men in suits and hats. In the streets, elegant carriages mixed with dray carts and delivery wagons. The buildings were changing as well, growing taller and wider. At 6th Avenue, a narrow ribbon of metal ran high above the street. He watched as a string of metal boxes ran along the ribbon, sending sparks into the street below. Through the train's tiny windows, he caught glimpses of men and women, their faces placid as they rushed by. He climbed a stairway to the platform, gave the ticket seller a few coins. A train soon arrived, squealing horribly as it halted. He boarded it and found a seat. More and more passengers entered the car until the seats were all taken and the stragglers were forced to press together in the aisles. The Djinni shuddered as the car filled past what seemed possible. The doors closed and the elevated strained forward. He'd thought it would feel like flying, but he was soon disabused of that notion. The train vibrated as though to shake the teeth from his head. Buildings flashed past so close to the window that he recoiled. He debated getting off at the next stop and walking the rest of the way, but the other passengers seemed to chide him with their nonchalance. He clenched his jaw and watched the streets grimly as they sped past. 59th Street was the end of the line. He descended the staircase, feeling a bit sick. It was late in the afternoon and the sky was clouding over, turning to a grey-white sheet. Across from the station rose a wall of greenery. A high iron fence ran along it, as though to hold back something wild. There was a wide gap in the middle of the fence, and 6th Avenue disappeared inside, curving around and out of sight. A steady stream of pedestrians and carriages came and went. He crossed the street and passed inside. Almost immediately, the sounds of traffic faded away and were replaced by a descending hush. A grove of trees edged the path on both sides, turning the air cool and heavy. Gravel crunched under his shoes. Open carriages ambled past, the horses' hooves beating a pleasant rhythm. Smaller paths broke away from either side of the carriage road, some wide and paved, others little more than dirt tracks overhung with lush vegetation. Soon the shading grove came to an end, and the land opened into a vast swathe of rolling lawn. The Djinni stopped, stunned by the vivid sea of green. Trees bordered its far edges, shielding the city from view. In the middle of the lawn, a herd of plump, dusky white sheep stood peacefully together, eating lazy mouthfuls of grass. Benches lined the road, and here and there people sat, in pairs or threes, or the occasional solitary gentleman, though women were never alone in public, he had noticed this, and watched the carriages go by. He stepped off the path and walked about in the grass for a few moments, feeling the earth give and spring back. He bounced on the balls of his feet, unaware of the smile that rose to his lips. Briefly, he considered abandoning the path altogether and walking the length of the lawn, perhaps without his shoes. But then he spied a small sign staked into the ground that read, "Please stay to the path." And indeed, a few passers-by were frowning at him in admonishment. He thought the rule absurd, but had no wish to be noticed. So he stepped back onto the path, vowing to return at night, when hopefully he could do as he liked. The carriage road branched away east, and the Djinni followed its curve over a pretty wooden bridge. Through a copse of tall trees, he spied a long, straight path of shining grey-white. He left the road to investigate, and the grey-white path revealed itself as a broad promenade of flagstone, lined with high, arching trees. There were more people here than on the carriage path, but the scale of the space was so grand that he took little notice of the crowd. Children ran past, and one boy's hoop went rolling away from him, tilting across the Djinni's path. Startled, he plucked it from the stones and gave it back to the boy, who ran to catch up with his fellows. The Djinni continued on, wondering about the function of the hoop. Eventually, the broad walk descended into a tunnel that cut beneath a carriage road. On the other side of the tunnel, a broad plaza of red brick curved along the shore of a pond. In the middle of the plaza, he saw what he took at first for an enormous winged woman floating above a foaming cascade of water. No, not a woman, a sculpture of a woman, perched atop a pedestal. The water flowed into a wide, shallow basin at her feet, and then into a pool that stretched almost the width of the plaza. He walked to the pool's edge and watched the fountain, entranced. He'd never thought to see water sculpted this way, in sheets and streams that changed constantly. It wasn't as frightening as the giant expanse of New York Harbour, but he still felt a not quite pleasant thrill. A fine spray struck his face, a smattering of tiny needles. Serenely, the woman hung above him. In one hand, she carried a slender stem of flowers. With the other, she reached out, gesturing to he knew not what. Her wings stretched out behind her, wide and curved. A human woman with the inhuman power of flight. But if Arbeli was to be believed, wouldn't they be frightened by such a woman? And yet the artist had sculpted her with reverence, not fear. There was movement next to him. A young woman standing nearby, watching him. He glanced at her, and she quickly turned her head, pretending to study the fountain as well. She wore a dress of dark blue that cinched tightly at the waist, and a large hat with a rolled brim adorned with a peacock feather. Her brown hair was gathered in ringlets at the nape of her neck. By now the Djinni had seen enough of human costumes to know that everything about her spoke of wealth. Strangely, she seemed to be alone. She glanced back at him as if unable to help herself, and their eyes met. Hers darted away again. But then she smiled, as though conceding defeat, and turned to face him. "I'm sorry," she said. "You seemed so entranced by the fountain, but it was rude of me to stare." "Not at all," he replied. "I'm indeed entranced. I've never seen anything like this before. Can you tell me, who is the woman with the wings?" "She's called the Angel of the Waters. She blesses the water, and all who drink it are healed." "Healed? Of what?" She shrugged her shoulders, a gesture that made her seem even younger than he thought. "Of whatever ails them, I suppose." "And what," the Djinni asked, "is an angel?" This question made her pause. She glanced over him again, as if reassessing him. Likely she'd already noticed the inferior cut of his clothing and the accent in his English, but this question must have implied a strangeness not evident in his appearance. She said, "Well, sir, an angel is a messenger of God, a heavenly being, higher than man, but still a servant." "I see." In fact, her words made little sense to him, but he sensed that pressing her further would be a mistake. He'd have to ask Aunt Beely. "And this is what angels look like?" "I suppose," she said. "Or perhaps this is one way of picturing them. It all depends on what you believe." They stood, not quite together, gazing at the fountain. "I've never seen anything like her," he said. He felt he must speak again, or risk the girl drifting from him. "You must be from very far away if your country has no angels," she said. He smiled. "Oh, but there are angels in my land. I only didn't know what was meant by the word." "But your angels aren't like her?" She nodded at the woman who hovered over them. "No, not like her. In my land, the angels are made of an everlasting fire. They can change form to whatever suits their mood, and appear to men's eyes in that form, as the whirlwind appears in the dust that it carries." She was listening, her eyes on him. He went on. "The angels in my land serve no one, neither higher than themselves nor lower. They roam where they wish, led only by their whims. When they encounter one another, they will sometimes react with violence or else passion. And when they encounter humans," he smiled down into her staring eyes, "the results are often the same." She glanced away hotly. For a few moments there was only the sound of the water and others' conversations. "Your land," she said finally, "sounds like a savage place." "It can be, at times." "And in your land, is it considered proper to talk this way to a woman in a public park?" "I suppose not," he said. "Or perhaps the women of your land are different, that you would be so free with them?" "No, they are not so very different," he said, amused. "Although until now I would have said that they surpassed those here in both beauty and pride. And now I find my assumptions are shaken." Her eyes went wide. She drew breath to answer him, and he wanted dearly to hear whatever she would say. But suddenly she glanced to her left and took a step away from him. An elderly woman in a stiff black dress and a veiled hat was approaching. The young woman, with effort, restored her features to neutrality. "Thank you for waiting, dearest," said the old woman. "There was a terrible line. You must have thought I'd deserted you." "Not at all. I've been enjoying the fountain." The old woman looked darkly over the girl's head at the Djinni, and then whispered something to her companion. "Of course not," the young woman replied, barely audible. Auntie, you know I would never. He only tried to ask me a question, but I couldn't understand. I don't think he speaks English. She darted a quick, pleading glance at him. Please don't betray me. Amused, he dipped his head a fraction, the ghost of a nod. The impertinence, the old lady muttered, narrowing her eyes at the Djinni. She spoke more loudly now, assuming he wouldn't understand, though of course her tone was plain. I'm sorry, Sophia. I should never have left you alone. Really, Auntie, it's of no concern, the young woman said, embarrassment plain in her voice. Promise not to speak a word of this to your parents, or I won't hear the end of it. I promise. Good. Now let's take you home. Your mother will be beside herself if you aren't ready in time. I can't stand these parties. They're so wearisome. Don't say that, my dear. The season's just starting. The older woman took her companion's arm. Sophia, she had called her. Sophia glanced up at the Djinni. It was clear she wanted to say something, but couldn't. Instead, she allowed the older woman to escort her from the fountain, across the expanse of red brick. They ascended the staircase to the carriage drive, and then were gone from sight. Quickly, he dashed across the terrace, startling those in his path. He took the stairs 2 and 3 at a time. Near the top, he paused. Keeping out of sight, he watched from below as the 2 women approached a gleaming, open-topped carriage that waited on the drive. A man in livery opened the passenger door for them. "Milady, Miss Winston." "Thank you, Lucas," said the young woman as he helped her into the carriage. The man climbed onto his high perch and flicked the reins, and the carriage rolled smoothly away down the drive. The Djinni watched the carriage until it curved past a grove of trees and disappeared. He considered. It was late in the day and growing cold. The sky was still overcast and edging on threatening. Now would be the time to turn south and retrace his steps. No doubt Arbeely was wondering where he was. But the young lady had intrigued him. Moreover, the dark, aimless longings that had surfaced at the wedding party had returned, and he was not in the habit of denying his own impulses. Arbeely, he decided, could wait for him a few minutes longer. He had little to go on, only her name, but in the end it was almost absurdly easy to discover where Sophia Winston lived. He accomplished it by travelling eastward to the edge of the park, alongside the path her carriage had taken, and then, once he was through the gate and again on the city streets, asking the first man who passed by, "Winston? You mean Francis Winston? You must be joking." The man he'd stopped was large and jowly and dressed like a labourer. "He's in that new mansion at 60 Big heap of white bricks, big as asters. You can't miss it." He pointed north with a meaty finger. "Thank you." The Djinni strode off. "Hey!" the man yelled after him. "What you want with the Winstons, anyhow?" "I'm going to seduce their daughter," the Djinni called back, and the man's roar of laughter followed him up Fifth Avenue. He found the Winston residence easily, just as the man had said. It was an almost 3-story limestone palace, topped by dark gables that rose to high peaks. The house was set back from the street behind a swathe of neatly trimmed grass and a spike-topped iron fence that ran the length of the sidewalk. It hadn't yet acquired the thick patina of grime that clung to its neighbours, and it wore this newness with a quiet self-satisfaction. At the front of the house was an enormous lamp-lit portico. The Djinni walked past it and turned the corner, following the iron fence. Lights blazed in the tall windows beyond. He could see figures moving about inside, silhouetted behind drapery. At the back corner of the house, a thick hedge stretched out to meet the sidewalk, and the iron fence became an imposing brick wall, shielding the grounds behind the mansion from passing eyes. The Djinni eyed the fence. The bars were strong, but not especially thick. He eyed the distance between them. 2, he decided, would be enough. He wrapped a hand around each of the bars and concentrated. Sophia Winston sat disconsolate in her bedroom, still in her dressing gown, hair damp from the bath. The guests would be arriving in less than an hour. As her aunt had predicted, Sophia's mother was in one of her states, careening about the house like a loose parakeet, issuing orders to every servant within earshot. Her father had retreated to the library, his usual foxhole. Sophia wished she could join him, or else help put her brother George to bed. But George's governess disliked Sophia's interference, saying it undermined her authority. And if Sophia's mother found her mooning over travel journals in the library, there would be a row. Sophia was 18 years old, and she was lonely. As the daughter of one of the richest and most prominent families in New York, indeed in the country, it had been made clear to her, in ways both subtle and overt, that she was expected to do little more than simply exist, biding her time and minding her manners until she made a suitable match and continued the family line. Her future unrolled before her like a dreadful tapestry, its patterns set and immutable. There would be a wedding, and then a house somewhere nearby on the avenue, with a nursery for the children that were, of course, mandatory. She'd spend interminable summers in the country, travelling from estate to estate, playing endless games of tennis, chafing under the strain of being constantly a guest in someone else's house. Then would come middle age and the expected taking up of a cause, temperance or poverty or education. It did not matter so long as it was virtuous and uncontroversial, and furnished opportunities for luncheons with dowdy speakers in severe dress. Then old age and decrepitude, the slow transformation into a heap of black taffeta in a bath chair, to be displayed briefly at parties and then put out of sight, to spend her last days sitting bewildered by the fire, wondering where her life had gone. She knew she would not fight this fate. She didn't have the stomach for prolonged family strife, nor the fortitude to make her own way in the world. And so, to escape, she turned to fantasies of rebellion and adventure, fueled by the volumes in her father's library, journals that ignited her mind with tales of exotic lands and ancient civilizations. She dreamed of riding on horseback with a Mongol tribe, or floating down the Amazon to the heart of the jungle, or strolling in linen tunic and trousers through the colourful street markets of Bombay. The necessary privations of such travels, such as lack of proper beds or running water, were no matter, for in these dreams they were conveniently forgotten. Recently, she glimpsed an article on the late Heinrich Schliemann and his discovery of the lost city of Troy. All of Schliemann's colleagues had insisted that the city was only a Homeric myth, that Schliemann was chasing a fantasy. But Schliemann had triumphed. The article was accompanied by a photograph of a beautiful dark-eyed woman, arrayed like a warrior queen in ancient jewellery found at the site. She was Schliemann's Greek-born wife, who had assisted him at the excavation. And when Sophia read that this woman's name was also Sophia, she felt a bitter pang, as though her own best destiny had passed her over. If only it had been Sophia Winston draped in ancient jewellery, Sophia Winston standing at the dig with her intrepid husband, gazing down upon the golden face of Agamemnon. She could lose herself in these fantasies for hours. She'd been drifting in and out of one that very afternoon, during the walk in the park, to distract herself from her aunt's acid-tongue gossip and her dread of the impending party. At the time, the strange man at the fountain had seemed to materialise from out of the daydream, a tall and handsome foreigner who spoke to her in perfect English. Now, in the familiar light of her bedroom, she cringed to remember their conversation. He'd made her feel flustered and young and far out of her depth. Reconciling herself to the night ahead, she sat before the mirror and began to brush out her hair. Her maid had already laid out her gown, a new wine-red silk. She had to admit that she was looking forward to wearing it. The new season's fashions were quite flattering to her figure. Something moved at the edge of her vision. She turned, startled. A man was standing on her balcony, just beyond the French doors, peering in through the glass. She jumped up and nearly screamed, clutching her dressing gown to her neck. The man raised his hands and looked at her pleadingly, plainly asking her not to raise an alarm. She squinted at the glass, past her own thin reflection, and realised it was him, the man from the park. She goggled. How had he got onto the grounds? Her room was on the second floor. Had he scaled the wall and then climbed across the balconies? She hesitated a moment, then picked up the lamp and stepped toward the French door, the better to see him. He watched as she approached. Through the distortions of the glass, he seemed almost impossibly still. She paused a few feet from the door, debating. She could still scream. The man smiled and extended an arm. An invitation to talk? Heart pounding, she fetched a shawl and stepped out onto the balcony.
Scandalous. So where did the Djinni learn to flirt if he, never interacted with humans before? And with only Arbeli to teach him?
He's got game inbuilt.
Amongst each other.
Oh, I think we've lost Carmen.
Oh no! Oh,
He's still awake. He's still awake. Oh,
Yeah.
hello. Oh, just going on the edge.
Oh,
Oh,
I'm gonna sleep.
oh bless
I
you.
think I missed the last couple of lines, but
Oh. Oh,
okay. Good night.
oh, night.
This was lovely.
Good to see you.
I love it so much when people fall asleep on Storytime.
Oh,
I love it so much.
oh.
I really like it.
We have an asleep Katie as well.
We have a sleep Katie as well.
Oh.
Oh.
So cute.
Oh.
Nice to be back for the actual story, as in live.
I didn't hear that, my love.
I think it's nice to be back live for the story.
Nice to have you back live for the story.
Have you? Yeah.
Exciting.
So, is everybody shipping Michael and Rava yet? Or...
Yeah. Check out my name.
Oh, yes, perfect. Okay, good.
I love
It's not just me. It's just like so.
so good.
There was a phrase at the end of Michael's reflection, having just met Chava, and I can't remember what it actually was, but I just remember everyone in the chat just sort of going, everyone nodding essentially, just being like, "Oh, that was really well phrased," or something like that.
Oh, I think it was feeling like he was the one who had been laid bare or something like that.
That was it. That was totally it.
He didn't know that, we don't just look new people in the eye directly.
Definitely not.
We're going to
Have
run
that kind of
away
intimacy.
Oh, night, Katie.
and put the stew in the shed because we can't put it in the fridge because the fridge is too full of pudding.
You all living your
That's a sensible problem to have.
We're just like Chava.
Yeah, I was going to say, who's enjoying the pastries chat? Pastries for the final night?
Oh, I really enjoyed the Djinni discovering taste.
Yes, I sort of took subtle Gordon-esque notes because he's not here, but so the dessert is sort of like the closest thing to heaven on earth. Being sold as that was very cool, and then drinking coffee is an assault. Enjoyed that.
I love that. I love that. And I love that you took notes. I'm definitely going to tell Gordon that you took notes. He will be so delighted.
Yeah, that's for him.
Honestly, the times I've done it, it's been really fun. Like, I've just genuinely enjoyed the process of taking notes while listening. Okay. Thank you, Gordon, because I wouldn't have thought of that otherwise.
I'll be honest, before we started the book, I just assumed the Djinni and the Golem were going to get together. I'm not sure whether they will or not in the end, but it's quite nice that that didn't happen yet anyway.
I like that they have like these two kind of completely separate, like they haven't met, but you know, these two very much like separate lives, for all that there are kind of you know, parallels between them, and they're in the same kind of situation and things. And I just think it's nice how everyone sort of will gradually winch together. Oh, we should say goodbye to the catch-up crew. Goodbye to the catch-up crew. I hope you enjoyed it. And see you soon. We love you. We love you very much. Bye, catch-up crew. Good night.